Good morning. And I'm very happy to be with you on this Thanksgiving weekend. And it being Thanksgiving, and that's our theme for today, I would like to start by saying thank you for asking me to be here with you this morning. And I think for me, of all of the holiday feasts, I've always had a particular fondness for Thanksgiving, and maybe a part of that is the time of year, particularly as we've had it over these past days with the glorious color and the new and the Christmas in the air. And maybe it's also because of the big dinner, and the turkey and all of those things are pretty good. But for me, it's pretty much any excuse for pumpkin pie. And but this year is a bit different for me, though, because as Catherine mentioned in her introduction, I've just moved back to Ottawa from BC. So, Graham, I was here before, so I do know about the winter that's coming. But I just moved back after having been away for several years to be working for the new Eastern Ontario Outaouais Regional Council. And so I'm still in kind of a transition time where there aren't any regular routines and traditions where I slot in. So I haven't quite been sure for a while, will there be a dinner for me this year? And in fact, a few weeks ago, I was starting to feel a bit sorry for myself, imagining that I would just be sitting alone in my tiny apartment without anyone to have Thanksgiving dinner with. Now, fortunately, I have received a few invitations since then, and one of them is from the grandparents. These are people that I've just met, but the grandparents of a young woman I've been doing some work with, and we've been working together organizing various arts gatherings in a local coffee shop, which is a kind of a version of a local cluster for people who wouldn't typically be involved in a regular church setting. And so I happened to meet her grandparents, who are snowbirds, who usually go to Florida for the winter, which means that they aren't around for Christmas. So every Thanksgiving, they gather the whole family together with various other waifs and strays like me and celebrate what they call Thanksmas. And so where they decorate the place with both pumpkins and a Christmas tree, and celebrate both occasions together. And I love the creativity of that invented word, Thanksmas. And so that word kind of got me thinking about another invented word that I recently heard about Thanksgiving. And that word, and maybe you've heard this before I have, but it makes a slight tweak from Thanksgiving to Thanks-living. And I think that there's something in this little change of one consonant from Thanksgiving to Thanks-living that's at the nub of my message today, and I think of what Paul is saying in today's scripture reading from the letter to the Philippians. So Thanks-living. So not just one day of the year when we celebrate the abundant gifts of the harvest season. In some ways, it's kind of easy to be thankful in the midst of plenty when we have a grand feast on the table and friends and family to gather with, for those who do. But Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, is stretching thankfulness further in a couple of interesting and different ways. And first of all, he starts out by saying, not just to be thankful, but to rejoice. He says it twice at the opening of the passage, as Graham read it for us earlier. So rejoice, and I will say again, rejoice. And in fact, in Philippians, the idea of joy and rejoicing is repeated twice here, and it occurs a total of 16 times in the letter to the Philippians, which is just a small little book. There's only 4 chapters in there, so it's really a recurrent central theme for the letter to the Philippians. And so he's not just talking about thankfulness, he's talking about full tilt rejoicing. And not just a celebration, as I said, one day of the year, but as Paul says, at all times and in all things. Rejoice in the Lord always, he says, and do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, with thankfulness, present your requests to God. So in all things and at all times, rejoice and be thankful. So that can be a little bit harder than being thankful for our plenty. And I often find that Thanksgiving, or thanks-living, as I've tweaked it here, doesn't actually come all that easily to many of us, even when it should. And at least for myself, as I've been thinking about this, I find that I don't say thank you half often enough. And it's not that I'm ungrateful, but so much about the things that we should be grateful for seems to go along with that sense of, well, it goes without saying. But then it doesn't get said. And then when it doesn't get said, it can easily slide out of view. And I think also thanks-living is not something that comes easily to our culture. We are in some ways a culture that's drenched in judgment, in easy criticism, in fault-finding and fixating on the one thing that goes wrong in a given situation, rather than being appreciative and thankful for all of the incredible number of things that are going right in any given moment. Those things that we do tend to take for granted, those things that sometimes remain unthanked. And it's kind of a small example, but I've got my cell phone here because I think of this every time any glitchy little thing goes wrong with my cell phone. And I must say that I've gone in the past few years from being a late and reluctant adopter of cell phones to being one of those people now who seems to have it with me at all times. And the intensity of my irritation, if it's slow, or if I can't get a connection, or it's never done this before, is just way out of proportion with the actual scope of the problem. It's, as the saying goes, it's a first world problem. It's not a big problem, but in the moment, that problem ends up overwhelming just about anything else I might be feeling in that moment. But then otherwise, when everything is working the way it should, I hardly give any thought to this technological miracle that I have at my fingertips. I lose sight of the miracle of it and the hard work of it that has come to be made into the miracle that it is, the way that it can be all too easy to lose sight of so many of the miracles that surround us, of nature, of friendship, of food on the table, of all the things in the world that exist and function, sometimes hiding in plain sight, when we get caught up in the problems that beset us, the things that go wrong. So thanks-living, even when it should be easy, doesn't come all that easily, even when times are good. So then, what about when times are hard? When things are confusing or uncertain or just aren't going the way we want? I find that there are a couple of other things in Paul's letter to the Philippians that I think give some cause for deeper reflection on being thankful, even in the tough patches. And one of these is that right at the beginning of the letter, earlier, not from the passage that we heard earlier, but in chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, Paul tells us that he's writing from prison. And scholars have different theories about which prison he was in, maybe in Rome, some people say maybe in Caesarea, or a few other possibilities. But regardless of where he was imprisoned, it's pretty clear that his circumstances would not have been easy. In fact, pretty much the opposite of plenty. But the irony is that not only does Paul, even from prison, still urge the Philippians to rejoice and live thankful, appreciative lives, he also says that his very imprisonment is actually helping to spread the gospel. People are hearing about his situation and talking about his message of following Jesus, not because at that time he's out bustling around the Mediterranean planting new churches, but because he's locked up and still on fire with the news of God's nearness and Christ's love for all. So I would expect Paul is probably not thankful about being in prison, but thankful that his imprisonment somehow serves, and I think similarly of someone like Nelson Mandela in South Africa during the years of apartheid, when he was imprisoned, that imprisonment becomes in itself a galvanizing force. So that's one thing about kind of Philippians and thankfulness in the context of hardship. And then sort of another little angle on that, turning back to the passage we heard earlier, another thing I find myself reflecting on is the sentence right after that repeated exhortation to rejoice in all things, where Paul says, "Let your gentleness be evident to all." Gentleness. Let your gentleness be evident to all. I find it's not a quality that we in our culture typically like to celebrate and lift up. I think we often like to be seen for our strengths, for our accomplishments, for our capacity to be doers and achievers, in control of our lives and making things happen on top of our game. Those are the things we want to be evident for all. And gentleness isn't the opposite of these qualities, but it can look pretty tame and maybe even a little weak compared to all those robust, in charge of things attributes that we like to hold up. And there's a number of interesting things to be said about this, because the Greek word epiekes, which is translated as gentleness in this version, is kind of complicated and gets translated differently in other versions. But I find in all of those translations, the most important thing is that they all, in their way, have a very strong association with Jesus. And not just Jesus in his gentleness, his commitment to peace and turning the other cheek, although that is a part of it, but also Jesus in his constant response in so many of the stories about Jesus as a healer, particularly, to those who are not in a strong place in their lives. They may be blind, they may be sick, they may be possessed by demons, they may be dying, or, as in the case of Lazarus, already dead. And these are the places where Jesus shows up. And that's not just in those stories, and not just for others who might be in situations where they are in need, but I find internally also in ourselves, in our own struggles and difficulties, in the places where things are hardest, not the places where we are already strong. Those are the places where Jesus shows up. And so then going back to prison, and it's in this context in which Paul, from those tough circumstances of prison, is asking the Philippians, who are also going through a time of struggle and conflict, he asks them in that context to be thankful and even to rejoice. Not to be thankful for the rough spots in and of themselves, but because they are the places where, as he also says in the passage as we heard, the Lord is near. So I find this kind of an important message, not just for this holiday weekend about giving thanks, but also as kind of a theme in my work with the Regional Council, as the church, and I think not just regionally, but also nationally, and I think in different ways in every community of faith, continue to feel our way forward through, I think, what can often still feel like bumpy and uncertain times. Times when it may seem like we are a long way from being on top of our game. A time when the whole changing, evolving, groping its way forward church can seem like it's one giant rough spot. And even for this, Paul is inviting us to be thankful. And maybe even especially for this. We are not in prison like Paul, but it could be that the very fact of our current changes and challenges, like the fact of Paul's imprisonment, is the place where the Spirit comes in to help spread the gospel in whatever new and different ways that might look for us in the 21st century and the unknown future that we're living into. And maybe that is the good news. Not that we've got it all together, but that we don't. And that, to borrow Leonard Cohen's phrase about the crack in everything, which might also include parts of the United Church of Canada, that is where the light gets in. And there are sparks of light, signs of creativity and aliveness that are appearing and I think starting to grow and show up. There are a lot of things happening that might still be under the radar, but there is a sense of movement and growth even in the midst of times of struggle and change. And the light does get in, even in ways we might least expect. So let your gentleness be evident to all, Paul tells us. Let the places where you are not in control and certain, but open and searching, be a cause for gratitude. Do not be anxious, but in every situation, the bumpy and the smooth, with thanksgiving and thanks-living, present your requests to God, as Paul says. It is in this way that the God of peace and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will be with you. And to go back to my invitation to Thanksmas and my flutter of anxiety beforehand about whether I would be spending Thanksgiving all by myself, it's a good lesson, even in such a minor thing. So I'm thankful for the invitation, of course, but I'm also deeply thankful even more for the reminder to be thankful anyway. So in the tension between joy and worry, we are called to a life of gratitude and thankfulness. And I think this is not a Pollyanna dismissal of troubles or a grim celebration of them, but a matter of confidence and trust in the nearness of the Spirit. So when Paul says the Lord is near, I don't think he's saying the Lord will soon come, but rather his words are an affirmation that the God of our understanding, whatever that means for us, is with us in the constant day-to-day struggles of our lives. So, on this Thanksgiving Day, I pray that the peace that passes understanding will fill your lives with thankfulness and rejoicing in all things. In those things obvious, in those things obscure, and even in those things objectionable. In everything, give thanks. Happy Thanksgiving and happy Thanks-living.